As I turn it back to Ryan Streeter to introduce Deirdre McCloskey, I just need to personally say I have been buying her book, Economical Writing, for 30 years and handing it to our PhD students. So I'm delighted to meet her finally after all these years. And I already talked about to one of the PhD students in government in this audience that they need your book. And I am just glad to be part of a small channel of paying that forward to young scholars, both in the audience and in our own programs. So Ryan, I'll hand it back to you. Welcome. We hope you spend a lot of time here. And I'm so glad to have so many thought leaders on dynamism speaking here today. So thank you.
Thank you, Dean Mills, for those remarks. And let's kick things off here. It's my pleasure to introduce Deirdre McCloskey to you, who is a senior fellow and Isaiah Berlin Chair of Liberal Thought at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C., and since 2015, Distinguished Professor Emerita of Economics and History and Professor Emerita of English and Communication at the University of Illinois at Chicago. The author of 25 books, over 500 articles in economic theory, economic history, philosophy, rhetoric, statistics, feminism, ethics, law, and liberalism. Like many of you, I've learned a lot from Dr. McCloskey's work over the years. My thinking, as I'm sure many of yours, has been shaped by the Bourgeois trilogy on equality, dignity, and virtues, and her other works on why liberal values have made us all more prosperous, and her interdisciplinary way of treating subjects that kind of risk getting mangled when we just approach them through just one discipline. So please join me in welcoming Deirdre McCloskey.
Thank you very much. I have a speech defect which you can either adjust to or run screaming from the room. It's a free country. I'm an economist by training, but as my introduction might suggest, I'm like my heroine, Mae West. She said, "I was Snow White, but I drifted." And that's me. In the process of this drift, I've come to certain scientific and political conclusions about how we became so rich and flourishing. Not just rich in income and stuff and goods and services, but in scope. Human ability to pursue one's course in life. And I attribute this change, which has come over the world only in the last 2 centuries, as caused by my favorite word, which I always stutter on, aside from the word stutter, liberty. And it was new, and it had shocking effects. Now, it's terribly important to understand, and I hope it's the main takeaway, main factual takeaway that you take away from my talk this morning, to understand the magnitude of this change. I was just reading Tocqueville's Democracy in America, which if you haven't read, you ought to read. My word, it's an amazing book. In the 1830s, he says it's very, very hard. He was not much of a quantitative person to compare French and US income per head. And perhaps for certain subtleties by then, it may have been hard. By now, it's very clear that everyone in this room is vastly richer than your ancestors were. I look around the room, I don't see any Habsburg chins. I take it, like me, you're the descendants of utterly impoverished and probably illiterate peasants from Europe or Asia or Africa. And yet here we are, discussing the history of the world and how it happened and what the prospects are. What the prospects are for dynamism. Because what's happened in the last 2 centuries can only be described as a dynamic explosion. You know, the word dynamite comes from Greek, and it's about explosions. And here's the story. Here's the basic story that every competent historian, well, many non-quantitative historians don't quite get it, but any quantitative historian, any economist who knows what she's talking about, or any economic historian understands perfectly well. Our race, the one race that we have in the world, namely the human race, Homo sapiens, appears to have been appears to emerge first in Africa, especially southeastern Africa, where everyone in this room is an African. And about 300,000 years ago, it's unclear when language comes to be, this crucial technology, this artificial intelligence machine of speech and conversation and stories. But in any case, our genes, our peculiar set of human Homo sapien genes, are about 300,000 years ago. And the evidence is overwhelming that for the utter bulk, let's speak quantitatively now, of this period since 300,000 BC in Africa, income per head, expressed in modern prices, Austin prices, was about $2 a day. Imagine trying to get along in Austin right now on $2 a day. You'd have to sleep rough. You wouldn't be educated because you know that's part of the income. You would have one set of clothing, if any. Your life would be not solitary, but nasty, brutish, and short for sure. So let's draw a diagram. Economists love diagrams, and I do. And let's make this zero, okay? This is zero. Starvation, you're going to starve in a week or two if your income per head is zero. And let me put it down as far as I can. That's zero, and this is $2 a day. And the present is over there. And we go along like this. You know, you can make a case that hunter-gatherer existence had its charms. People didn't work too hard, for example, if they were in a fruitful environment, such as what's now the American Northwest with lots of fish. They could be kind of take lots of holidays and have lots of feasts, but still here they were at $2 a day. They couldn't go to university. There wasn't such a thing, and here we are, $2 a day, $2 a day. And on the eve of this explosion, this dynamism, poof, in 1800, the rich United States was at $6 a day, which is still pretty pathetic. And England, Scotland were at $6 a day. Holland, the Dutch Republic, was about $6 a day, which is what you could get if you were efficient and commercial in a world in which, in general, people earn $2 a day. you could get a little bit better. If you were a king or a priest, high priest, you could get a lot more than that. But ordinary people, our ancestors, $2 a day, and in the United States, maybe $6. And now we're at 1,800. Got to be careful I don't fall off the stage. That's 300,000. By the way, about here is the agricultural revolution, which made in 9 different parts of the world, not just in the Fertile Crescent, in what now is Iraq, invented the domestication of plants and animals. It's a deep scientific puzzle why it happens in 9 different parts of the world after the last ice age. Because there were a series of ice ages and then warming periods and ice age and warming periods for the last million years. And it's only after this last one that in places apparently unaffected by the melting of the ice, except for the height of the sea, such as sub-Saharan Africa and New Guinea, Central America, and Peru. Nonetheless, they invented agriculture. So that's not a concern of mine, that's the archaeologists. But anyway, here we are. So there's an uprising because agriculture is a more secure way of getting your sustenance, though you have to work more. Then, on Malthusian reasoning, this temporary enrichment let more children survive infancy and early childhood. Women had more surviving children, and the population grew. And then, by Malthusian logic, that drove down the income per head back to $2 a day. $2 a day being bare subsistence. Incidentally, the Malthusian model, which is still in a lot of people's heads, stopped being true more or less on the day that Thomas Malthus in 1798 published the, treatise on population. It hasn't been true since 1800. It's true before, but not after. Okay, anyway, so here we are. This is the agricultural revolution. And then right on the edge here, we're at 1800. And it goes up from $2 a day worldwide to $50 a day within 2 centuries. $50 a day is now the average. To sort of fix ideas, think of Brazil. Brazilians earn about $50 a day. Think of China, which after it's freed from Mao's crazy economic ideas and adopted what we sadly call capitalism. It went up to it's at $50 a day. A place like the United States, it's $130 a day. A place like Switzerland, it's $180 a day. Now understand, this isn't some monetary price thing. This is real. That magnitude is stunning, and that's scientifically what we need to explain. Now there are 2 ways of explaining it. One, you can classify politically as being on the right, on this silly left-right spectrum we talk about all the time. We classical liberals, which is what I am, we're not on this spectrum. We're not conservatives. We're not left-wing. We're in a treehouse above this spectrum of left and right, shouting down to them, do you really want as large a government as you seem to want? Come on, guys, maybe that's not a good idea. But anyway, on the right, the argument is about investment. On the left, the argument is about exploitation. And it says that amazing hockey stick, we call it in the trade, not a field hockey stick, but an ice hockey stick that Canadian men just love this metaphor. It goes It's important to have the sound effects. It's what made our lives in this room. Without it, we'd be poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And our lives would be not short. We actually would be short in stature, but our lives would be poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So the right-wing explanation, you might say, is the one you've heard all the time: investment. It's what we economists think we understand about economic growth. We think, well, getting more capital is a good idea, getting more machines and buildings and automobiles and roads, and boy, that sounds really great. Let's have more of those. But the trouble is that without innovation, which capital accumulation is not, piling bricks on bricks, piling BAs on BAs, even in entrepreneurship at the University of Texas, does not itself cause an increase in income. What causes an increase in income in the dynamic sense, in this astounding magnitude, in this completely unprecedented way, is new ideas. New ideas which in the first instance always come from a single human mind. I just learned the other day about an amazing invention in the way we build houses in the United States and Canada. Turns out that the balloon frame technique was invented, this as an economic historian, shamefully I didn't know this, in the 1830s by an American carpenter, inventor, entrepreneur. And it depended on the previous invention of the bandsaw. A bandsaw for cutting lumber to precise dimensions, standardizing them. So the famous 2x4, which is, anyone who's used it knows, is not 2x4, it's 1.5 by 3.5. But anyway, 2x4, 2x6, 2x8, etc. This allows you to build houses framed and externally and internally, and the frame holds up the walls. All earlier building techniques are either heavy lumber inside, like a barn. Think of an average American barn. And that's one of the old ways. And by far the commonest old way is load-bearing external walls. So that's it. One person thought of this. One person in the 1950s thought about containerization. Let's do standardized boxes, 20 feet and 40 feet, pile them on ships, and send them to China. And that's how we now import and export. But sheer investment without this new idea that some individual has come up with has, economists say, sharply diminishing returns. It almost stands to reason. You have a car, I suppose, most of you. Suppose you get a second car. Well, that means your husband can have one too. That's nice. Suppose you get a third one and a fourth. You keep investing in cars. Pretty soon you have 10 cars. Most of them are junk in the front yard, right? So they're sharply diminishing returns to sheer investment. So there's something deeply screwy about the idea that there was a change in the savings rate or the ability to invest right here, and suddenly, poof, we got economic growth. Walt Whitman Rostow used to be a professor here at UT. I was offered his chair here after he died, and I wonder maybe I should have become a Texan. But in any case, he said it was a rise in the savings rate in Britain that caused this sharp increase in K. We call it K in economics in honor of the German word for capital, and that's wrong on all kinds of grounds. It's not true that savings rates and therefore capital accumulation in Britain was any greater than it was in other countries like France. It's not true that capital by itself is creative. It's not. Allocating it correctly is a good thing. And we have whole departments of finance concerned with the allocation of capital. And I'm not against efficiency. I'm not against doing things right and investing correctly. But it's not in itself, sheer capital accumulation is not in itself creative. On the left, the argument is exploitation. I was once a socialist, a Marxist myself, so I understand this stuff and I understand its appeal. It appealed greatly to a young folk singing radical in the 1960s. That's me, go down and join the union. Arise, you prisoners of starvation. And from a kind of static point of view, as against dynamic, it looks very plausible. I mean, after all, someone's poor if they don't have much money. Come on. Jeff Bezos has a ton of money. He can't spend it fast enough, even buying newspapers and so on. So, hey, let's hang the bankers and let's get the money from Jeff Bezos and hand it out to poor people, and that'll enrich us. And the quantitative problem is that no, it won't. Of course it'll make the rich better off to have more money. There's a cartoon back in the days of LBJ's War on Poverty in the New Yorker, in which showed a bank truck pulled up to the curb, and the bank guards were handing out money from big bags of money to passersby. And one of the passersby said, "Thank God the war on poverty has begun. We just give people money and they're better off." Of course they are. All right. But quantitatively, we can't explain an increase in everyone's income with redistribution. So the obsession in the last 10 years or so about inequality, I think is misleading. Because inequality doesn't explain very much. You may not like it, I don't. I'd rather that everyone had equality of what I call permission. Not equality of outcome or opportunity, but equality of permission. Take the hooks and chairs out of the way of people. But that's by itself, in a static sense, in the sense that we explain in economics courses, where we move resources from one use to another and see, oh boy, here we've got 5% more income from doing that. That's not going to explain 2,500%, 3,000%, in some countries, 10,000%. We might, through improvements in legal institutions, say, like my friend Doug Norris used to say, get, a doubling of income. Well, I'm all for a doubling of income. If you want to give money to me to double my income, buy my books, and it'll make me better off, I agree. But it's not 6,000%, 3,000%, the magnitudes that we're actually trying to explain. So that's the first problem with exploitation. It's zero sum, so far as growth is concerned. And Europe's not rich because it exploited the rest of the world. That can be shown quantitatively to be wrong. I know it's irritating to our friends in South Asia, intellectuals in South Asia who want to blame the West, for England in particular, for Indian poverty or South Asian poverty, but that's just not the case. And I could go into the details in the Q&A. By the way, start thinking of questions, because I'm not going to spend my whole time talking. So, Deirdre, what is it? If it's not investment, if it's not exploitation, what is it? And the answer, I claim, is that it's the force of liberal ideas. It's the force of equality of permission. I understand that the way we talk about equality, if you're a socialist, as I was, you think of it as equality of outcome. And if you're a standard issue, middle of the road person on the spectrum, you call it equality of opportunity. But I want to point out to you that neither of these is actually achievable. We know that if you try to impose on a big society, on a little society like a family or a group of friends, sharing the pizza works just fine, right? But in a big society, giving people equal outcome doesn't work at all. It results in equality of poverty. St. Paul said famously, "He who does not work should not eat." And that's right. If we're going to make it work, if we're going to have anything at all, people have to work. And it's very tempting if a street sweeper and a brain surgeon get the same income as I would like. I mean, I'd prefer it. Obviously, any Christian as I am would like people to earn the same, and I get it. But if we try to do it on a big scale, it really is disastrous. And it hasn't actually been tried very much. The old Soviet Union said it was doing it, but we know for a fact that they didn't do it. But how about equality of opportunity? Well, the trouble with that is that we can't be equal in that respect. You may have better parents than your friend, your ne'er-do-well friend. You may grow up in Austin instead of South Sudan. The only way to make a child that grows up in South Sudan equal to someone who grows up in Austin is to immediately take them out of South Sudan and put them into Austin. People vary in intelligence, beauty, height, health, the chances of life. As Ecclesiastes, that curious book in the Hebrew Bible, says, "The race is not to the swift or the battle to the strong, for time and chance happeneth to all." And that's certainly true. So equality of opportunity, equality at the starting line, so to speak, as against this ideal in socialism of equality at the finish line, is impossible to achieve. What we can achieve and started achieving in 1776 and subsequent years, slowly, with great struggles, is equality of permission. You let, by the time of Andrew Jackson, poor men vote. You let, by the end of the Civil War, black men vote. You let women vote. You leave queers alone. You stop imperializing over other countries. All these things gradually made people equal in their not opportunity, but their permission to join the race, however they started. And that's the central liberal idea. Liberals, by any definition, whether left liberals or right liberals or Cato Institute liberals, believe in equality. In the 18th century, the conception grew among advanced intellectuals in Northwestern Europe that the old rule, the old rules being things like kings always win, women always lose. We said, to hell with that. As Thomas Paine said, we have the power to make the world again. And one way we made it was to slowly agree to more and more people getting permission. Now, who gives the permission? Well, society does. Ideology does. Our convictions about how to treat other people do. Those are the rules of society, what Tocqueville called in French, moule, the customs. And he said those were much more powerful than any amount of coal in the ground or ports that look good and that kind of thing. It was the more, the ideologies and convictions of ordinary people that made for a prosperous society. And so that's my explanation. Liberalism uniquely comes to Northwestern Europe and then spreads. Now, there are straws in the wind before in Europe. 1685, a leveler named Richard Rumboldt is hanged in Edinburgh because James the II didn't like what he was saying. And he was allowed, as you are under Scottish and English law, to deliver a little speech before they pull the rope. And he said, "I think that no man is born of God above another, for none comes into the world with a saddle on his back, neither anyone booted and spurred to ride him." Quite interestingly, in the last letter that Thomas Jefferson ever wrote in 1826, he died a few weeks later, he quoted this without attribution. It was commonplace, lots of people knew it, and then proceeded to not free even his own children from slavery. So Tom had some problems, some conflicts. But all right, equality of permission is what made the modern world. And you can see this in your own lives. Look, if you're an artist or a craftsperson or a cook or anything, and you're permitted to try stuff out. You're going to invent stuff. Sometimes it's going to be a disaster, and you say, "Whoops, that didn't work." But if you're allowed to try things out, if you're said, "No, you can't try things out. You're a slave. I told you what to do. Shut up and do it," then you're not going to get innovation. Every year in the United States, the marketing people here know this, 30,000 new consumer packaged goods, new ones, are tried out somewhere. Obviously not all of them in one store, or the store would go bankrupt. They're tried here, they're tried there. 30,000. Only 5% of them become permanent items in grocery stores or hardware stores or wherever they're being sold. So the churning ability, which you're going to hear about in the next talk in a quantitative way, the churning of enterprises and employment and innovation, the innovation behind it, is what made us well off. Now, you can make arguments that it's corrupting. I have a book called The True and Godly Liberal, Public Theology for an Age of Innovism, which I'm trying to sell. If you know anyone who will publish it, please tell me. It's an attempt to show that what we unfortunately call capitalism is not corrupting of the soul. That you can be both a Christian and an active person in a market economy. This is something that other people have said, but I'm saying it, so you got to pay attention. It's really great stuff. It's this liberty that's the key. It's new. As I show in the third volume of my trilogy called The Bourgeois Era, published in 2006, 2010, 2016. Great big thick books which you're urged to buy. By the way, all of them are on Audible, so you can read them as you're commuting or jogging. I highly recommend it. They argue that this liberty is what did it, and explain how it came about in Northwestern Europe, and only in Northwestern Europe. It could have happened in China, Japan, India, the Ottoman Empire. It could have happened, but it didn't for various reasons in the period in which it did happen, which was the 18th century, the 1700s. So that's my argument. In a way, it's blindingly obvious. New ideas come from people. Duh, as the kids say. Of course they come from people. Companies don't create ideas. Nations don't create ideas. Families, in a way, do, because there's a family culture of innovation. My family is among them. That's why all three of the kids have been creative in some way because of our mom. But in any case, it's my sister's research in family violence. I don't know how she stands it. She's been doing it for decades. Is her idea. It's not the University of Arizona's idea or Indiana University's idea. It's her idea. So I'm making a case for turning economics and political science, sociology, business studies away from the old way of talking about entrepreneurship, which says, well, we can make entrepreneurs by having courses in entrepreneurship, which I'm highly dubious of, and away from capital accumulation, and certainly away from exploitation as a account of the modern world, and towards the coming of and the fruit of liberty. Equality of permission, the dignity that comes from that made us rich and reasonably happy. Thank you very much. So let's have some Q&A here. You don't sell books by saying, as I do, or as my colleagues at Cato who speak of superabundance do, saying things are going to be great and getting better, although that's what's happening. This pessimism is pervasive, and it's now gotten down to the kids who think that they shouldn't have children because of population growth, which is ridiculous. Population will peak at a little over 9 billion people and then start falling in a few decades, but relax. They say our grandchildren and children think the world is coming to an end environmentally. They feel, and I think they're wrong. I think they're mistaken. But anyway, saying they're wrong doesn't seem to help. Showing them that there are technologies of carbon capture that are getting better and better and cheaper, non-oil-based sources of energy that are getting cheaper and cheaper. This apparently has no effect on them. I said, oh yeah, but still it could be the end of the world. There's a long history of thinking that the end is near. Another New Yorker cartoon shows a couple walking along, and they've just passed a guy in a long white robe and a beard, carrying a sign, "The end is near." And one of the couple says to the other, "Wasn't that Paul Krugman?" And so it goes. My friend Tyler Cohen wrote a book about 10 years ago saying average is over. And I've kind of poked him saying, now, Tyler, you know that that's false, that the last 10 years have falsified what you said. And he gets very angry and uncomfortable. But it's true. It was a really dumb thing for him to say. But it sold books. He sold a lot of books. My books don't sell as much. It's very irritating. But there may be a deeper reason. There may be built into our genes a cautionary principle, such as, are you going to occupy this new cave? Well, you better make an assumption that a cave bear is already there and carefully test that possibility before you rush in. So I don't know. Ask Bob Gordon why he's so pessimistic. It's not true that economic growth has radically slowed down in the United States even, or in Britain. Part of the reason I argue this is something that lots of economists know but don't take enough allowance for, which is that the quality of goods is increasing. I just had a knee replacement, total knee replacement. Well, that technology didn't exist for my grandparents. Indeed, you can take your cell phone, say, well, all it is a telephone. No, it's not. It's much more. We don't buy cameras anymore because the quality of the lenses in these things has gotten better, and so on and so forth. And that's about 2% a year, improved quality of the goods and services we have. So there are reasons of a technical and quantitative sort to doubt what you said. But if I was Queen of the United States, I would resign. Because my recommendation is that we leave people alone. I don't mean a scornful, I'm richer than you, screw you attitude. No, I want to help poor people, and I do. I tithe with my church. I'm an Episcopalian. I give 10% of my income to the church, which is more skilled at helping poor people than I am. And so I'm not saying we shouldn't be charitable. I am saying that the old joke, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you, is true. That it's extremely unlikely that wise men and women in Austin or Washington know how to make you better off. They know how to make their supporters better off, but they don't know how to make you better off. So honestly, I'm not an anarchist. I believe we should have government for some things. But like most classical liberals, I regard the expansion of modern government to be shocking. And that's true on both the left and the right of the political spectrum. Nowadays, as you know, in the United States, the, I forget what they're called, but the national conservatives, is that what they're called? They want to have a big government. They want to have a big government so that they can monitor women's reproductive history, so that they can send spies and watch every woman in the United States to make sure they aren't having an abortion, for instance. So our attitude, we classical liberals, is that we regard both of them, both sides of the spectrum in the middle, as misled. And as an economic historian, I can tell you that very few government programs have worked. Worked in the sense of passing a cost-benefit test. Let's take one that sounds just completely obvious. The subsidies to the transcontinental railways during and after the Civil War. They were grotesquely premature. Those railways should have been financed privately. Modern example is high-speed rail in China. China has more high-speed rail, 200 miles an hour. I've ridden on them, they're amazing, than all the rest of the world combined. Yet China earns only $50 a day. We earn $130, and we can't even get the high-speed rail from San Francisco to Los Angeles to work. The one route, as a former transport economist trained by John Mayer at Harvard, I can say is the Bow-Wash corridor, and we've made no progress in high-speed railing that. But for the rest, to have high-speed rail between Chicago and St. Louis is idiotic. So most government programs don't work.
So going off the queen question, forget being a queen, but what policy would you enact for the U.S.? Some things to kind of go off of are, we were talking about, term limits and how that might impact, like optimizing for long-term policy. So maybe something within that realm.
Well, I'm not too thrilled about term limits. The problem is that people just cycle between the private sector and the public, and they get paid off. If there are term limits, they get paid off immediately as soon as they retire from Congress. So I don't know, not too thrilled. I don't think that's the solution. But there are thousands of policies that needs to be dropped. Let me take one that you might not be familiar with if you're not old and full of prescription drugs. You are forbidden as an American to buy prescription drugs from Canada, even though the same companies make the drugs sold in Canada and the United States. But in Canada, the price of the drugs is 1/5 to 1/10 of what it is in the United States. Now, how did that happen? Well, my office, I can see K Street from my office at Cato. It's 1 block away. It's very irritating. On K Street in Washington, the drug companies have on the order of 1,500 people, high-level people, not secretaries or something, but high-level people explaining to Congress people that we really need to keep these drug prices up in the United States. And they've succeeded. You can make the case that they've simply corrupted the Congress people by paying for their campaigns. They've certainly corrupted the doctors of the United States by giving them all expenses paid vacations in Hawaii with their family for new drugs. They say, oh, well, we've got to have money for research. Most of it they spend on marketing. So that's a shocking example. Another shocking example is the Jones Act, which has been around for about a century, that interstate shipping on the high seas has to happen on American ships with American crews. Now, Puerto Rico is part of the United States. And so it completely screws Puerto Rico. Take this poor part of our country. The Jones Act, go look into it. The Jones Act is simply appalling. And on and on and on and on. And those, if we start doing equality of permission, those will go away. As in bulk they did since 1800. I mean, after all, before 1800, economies in Europe and China and everywhere, especially Japan, were very closely regulated by the state. And we gradually, we worked around it. We often worked around it, legally or illegally, and got economic growth, got innovation. So, as I said, as the Queen of the United States, I'd resign and by which I mean leave people alone.
Thank you. So I have one kind of fussy point and then one more empirical query. The fussy point is, I think you're quite convincing about equality of opportunity being
No, not equality of, oh yeah, okay.
of not feasible.
Yeah.
I think I have that right. And but the advocates of equality of opportunity are more cautious, I think, in practice than your objection gets at. In practice, they want movement in its direction rather than the thing itself. So public education for all is an example. That's not true?
That's why we have to, no, it is true, but that's why we have to think quantitatively.
Okay, I agree completely. So the equality of opportunity idea is like a regulative ideal. It's not like a practical program.
It's an ideal, but it's an ideal that you can't achieve even approximately.
I agree with that, but you can have more of it, like you can have more longevity, though you can't have immortality. The empirical question is, I really like the idea of equality of permission. I'm all for it, but the causal relationship between equality of permission and the massive growth in well-being that you describe, I think has 1,000 question marks next to it. And one reason is that equality of permission has to be operationalized. What's the hypothesis that we're testing and saying equality of permission at a date certain and then explosion? I don't think it's a testable hypothesis until we specify what equality of permission is. Does it mean A, private property rights? B, does it mean freedom of contract? C, does it mean access to occupations that were formerly foreclosed to persons?
Yeah.
And all of these things are matters of degree rather than yes or no. And,
Sure.
and then things get very complicated to test empirically. So the first thought is the specification would be required. And the second thought is whether it's over-inclusive and under-inclusive equality of permission. If you give everyone permission, let's say, to run a tugboat operation, that's not going to give you massive economic growth. And there are things like access to education, which may or may not count as equality of permission. Which are plausibly associated with economic growth. I think the data is very inconclusive there. You know of the new books on this. And also there are things that are plausibly associated with explosion and economic growth, including well-functioning institutions of multiple kinds. And whether those are all equality, the institution for equality of permission, unclear. So I love the idea. I think it's normatively novel and quite right. But the empirical hypothesis, at least for purposes of where we are in 2024, it's a research agenda rather than a check mark.
But I've done the research. Now, in these big books that I talked about, but I agree that it's. But I don't think it's an econometric problem, which you seem to be suggesting it was, that we do specifications and we run a regression with a black box mechanism. No, I think we can look into the black box. I'm more an engineer than an econometrician, although trained well for someone of my generation in econometrics, which means that modern sense, I'm an econometric idiot, but it's not econometrics that's going to solve this. That's not the research agenda. The research agenda is to get down into how innovations happen, how they actually happen, and to notice that free people do better, and to see, there are all kinds of possibilities. I think I agree it's a research agenda. But it's a pretty plausible hypothesis when you look at the biographies of people like Andrew Carnegie, the son of a poor Scottish weaver, or Thomas Edison, equally poor, and these people being permitted. And by the way, as you point out, occupational access is crucial to all this. In late 1940s, 5% of US occupations required a state license, not just certification by some private company, but a state license. Now it's 30%. And this is loco, this is insane. We don't need licenses to practice interior decorating, where the terrible error will be, we'll paint the wall with the wrong color of green. So I think we can get down into the, not even the microeconomics, the micro sociology, and the micro mechanisms. And there do our quantitative work, because you're perfectly right, it's a quantitative hypothesis. What I'm quite clear about is that these other explanations don't work, and volume 2 of my trilogy establishes this, at least historically. Sheer capital accumulation doesn't do it. Even human capital accumulation. Look, the Chinese, for centuries, had the best higher education in the world, and indeed the best elementary education in the world, and yet didn't have a great enrichment. Educational institutions, as we're now quarreling about right now in the United States, can be conservative and can reduce innovation. The very word innovation in English was not a good word until the 19th century. In the Oxford English Dictionary and Historical Principles, you can look at its history. And up to then, it's terrible. Hey, we don't want to do any of that innovation. That's dangerous. Let's get away with it. So there are lots of ways of finding this out. And I've explored a good many of them. I'd like more people to get off their sadly illogical econometric engine and go look at the actual human experience. There's someone at the back. Yeah, this will be one more. I could go on forever. We're going to close the door. We're going to lock you in here, and we'll bring in sandwiches. And for the next 8 hours, I'll persuade you. I don't want to convince you. That comes from Latin winco, which means I conquer. I don't want to conquer you. I want to do sweet talk, suadio, persuade.
Well, I actually have been persuaded because I read your 3 bourgeois trilogy. And
There's a man of taste.
It makes a compelling case that culture changes in England and the areas around there right before we see this huge increase in human wealth.
Yeah.
Why was it Northwest Europe there and then? Why not China in 800 or Rome, or why then and there?
There I admit that I haven't done enough research on the other places. I don't know. I know something about Chinese history and South Asian and Ottoman and so forth. But I, in order to get it right, to be sure, in the 3rd volume, it's all about this, answering this question of why did it happen in Northwestern Europe? And to do it correctly, you can't just stare at Northwestern Europe. You have to compare. And again, as you said, it's a research agenda. If we get off the mistaken arguments, we'll do better. If we stop thinking that capital accumulation, although necessary, but so is a labor force, so is rainfall, so is lots of things necessary. I mean, an infinite number of things actually for any particular event. But we need to focus on what was strange and bizarre about 18th century Europe. And it's not, by the way, this is an important point which I go into in the 3rd volume, and then have gone on thinking about it's not some special character of melanin-challenged people, people without white people. There's a pronounced tendency for Europeans to say, oh, well, Europeans are special, and that's why we did it. But as I said before in the talk, it could have happened in Japan, but the Tokugawa were determined not to let innovation happen, and they succeeded. Well, thank you very much. It's been an interesting talk.
Thank you, Dr. McCloskey, for your remarks and taking the questions, and for kicking us off with the historical perspective and also raising a lot of questions that I think we'll be addressing throughout the day.